To the people of the feudal world, the church forbade admiring nature. All her beauties were declared transient, low, like the flesh of a man, a rough and temporary vessel of his spirit. The new man entered into life as the master. For him the nature surrounding his world was the object of his activity, his practice. He had to study them in order to subdue and force him to serve himself. He had to explore the bowels of the earth. This was required by the developing industry. He had to cross the sea. This was demanded by the developing trade. The natural sciences escaped from the power of theology and won the right to exist with revolutionary courage. Science was the surest friend and assistant in the cause of the greatest gains of the age. The discovery of America, round the world travel, these remarkable events of history, were carried out with the help of a Renaissance culture. No wonder Columbus was a student of Paolo Toscanelli, and Magellan studied the sciences from mathematician and astronomer Rui Faliero. In parallel with the scientific study of nature, her ethical perception proceeded. The new man happily felt himself the offspring of nature, felt its beauty, and it gradually received a rich reflection in poetry and painting. Humanists recognized the legitimacy of interest in the sensual, emotional life of a person. It was a blow to the main formula of the ascetic ideology of the Middle Ages. From the apology of the senses, the glorification of love in the novellas tics, in the lyrics, in the epic and in the drama, from Decameron to Romeo and Juliet. But, trusting in the natural inclinations of human nature, humanism demanded that art overcome brute sensuality. However, this sensual principle appeared in its crude and direct form. It sometimes made itself felt in the field of art and was especially noticeable in the everyday life of the ruling classes, where the world of egoistic passions triumphed unchallenged, where everything was considered permissible in the pursuit of pleasures. The chronicles of this time are filled with innumerable tales of the wild revelry of sensuality, of widespread depravity, of incestuous marriages, of family crimes, of murders and poisonings. The most insidious criminals sat on the papal throne, on princely throne, in councils of the Signoria. Material interest, satisfaction of personal needs, this is what stimulated behavior. With this view of things, the end justified any means. A new ideology, especially at the beginning of its development, often used the experience of ancient antiquity. In Italy, the appeal to antiquity was the most active and organic. A country rich in antiquities, where the greatness of the ancient world was a living legend, took upon itself the mission to reveal to the mankind the treasures of ancient art. Resurrecting the forms of ancient culture, Italy believed that she rightfully inherits the glory of the ancient world. It seemed that the heir of Rome, Constantinople, who kept in the manuscripts and works of art the soul of ancient culture, while Europe remained in medieval darkness, passed this wealth of Italy as the foundation of a new culture. People who devoted themselves to the study and dissemination of ancient literature and philosophy, called their activities humanism, from the Latin word humanus, the human. This asserted that the content of the new culture created by people is human, earthly, and that this new culture is opposed to feudal culture, inspired not by human, but by divine, divina ideals. But along with humanism in the broad sense of the word, there was a direction guided by purely philological and narrow aesthetic interests, based solely on the museum study of ancient art. Possessing certain positive qualities, permeated with anti-ascetic spirit, this direction of humanism was at the same time detached from the interests of the people, and at times openly alien to them. It was of a closed, cell nature and, in its social nature, gravitated toward aristocratic circles. Humanists of a similar kind Engels called Philistines who do not want to burn their fingers. Active perception of ideas and images of ancient art was a response to the demands of the new time. Ancient heritage contributed to the formation of realistic principles of creativity, but the unconditional recognition of the authority of ancient art concealed in itself the negative aspects, The dual nature of the Renaissance culture had an impact in this area. Ancient art, full of lofty ideas, civil pathos and reflecting the living life of the ancient world, was prepared by cabinet scientists and court poets. And this peculiarly prepared antiquity, devoid of life, was elevated to the absolute and became a disastrous obstacle to the development of national creativity. The glorious traditions of ancient culture turned into a deadly aesthetic scheme, contrasted with modern artistic practice. Humanist scholars judged the national art from the height of the ancient ideal they created and ruthlessly condemned him. They saw in this art a violation of those absolute norms that they proclaimed as eternal and immutable laws of the beautiful, sanctified by the authorities of Aristotle and Horace. Italian humanist classicists tore national drama from folk roots. The classicists in Spain, pretending to be the legislators of taste, persecuted the great Lope de Vega. The faithful adherents of antiquity, like the Sydney aristocrat, sneered at the folk drama in England, and the learned French poets united in the Pléiade denied any dignity for the barbaric national art, saying that the greatest part of the skill is in imitation, and demonstratively stated, we like only what does not correspond to the people's taste. So, under the slogan of imitation of the ancient, there was a rejection of the original, folk foundations of art. The historical significance of the discovery of ancient civilization was, of course, not in servile obedience to ancient rules and patterns. The actual content of this great event had a completely different meaning. It is best explained in the beautiful, full of poetic power of Engel's words. In the manuscripts saved in the fall of Byzantium, ancient statues in the ancient Rome dug from the ruins of Rome, a new world appeared before the astonished West. Before its bright images the ghosts of the Middle Ages disappeared. In Italy an unprecedented flourishing of art came, which was a reflection of classical antiquity and which never was no longer possible to achieve. In Italy, France, Germany, a new, first modern literature arose. England and Spain soon afterwards had their classical literary epoch. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, Gospodarstdat, 1952, p. 3. The main reason for the revival of ancient culture, Engels saw in the fact that this powerful impulse predetermined the development of national realistic art. The true creators of the great art of the Renaissance were not learned pedants, these people of the second and third degree, as Engels called them disparagingly, but the real spiritual leaders and teachers of the awakened humanity. They were titans, by the power of thought, passion and character, by versatility and scholarship. They expressed in all their fullness and strength the progressive meaning of the great coup, because they were anything but bourgeois limited people. They almost all live in the very midst of the interests of their time, take a lively part in the practical struggle, take sides with one party or another, and fight whoever by word and pen, who sword, and who in that together. Hence the completeness and strength of character, which make them whole people. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, Gospodarstdat, 1952, p. 4. All of them were closely connected with the people, knew its burdens, views and dreams. Cervantes thought about the welfare of the people when he ordered his noble knight to brand the injustice of the world around him. Lope de Vega declared about the rights of the people when, with fiery inspiration, he demonstrated in the Fuente Ovejuna the revolutionary uprising of the peasants. On the strength of the people, about his health, his mind, Humor wrote in his book Rabelais. Wisdom of the people, his suffering, anger and optimistic faith were imbued with Shakespeare's tragedies. The dream of the people about a just, intelligent life was inspired by Thomas More in his Utopia and Campanella in his State of the Sun. Both of them had a humanistic thought already shown with the first glimpses of socialist ideas. A direct critique of the modern order that has evolved in a whole series of utopian formulas such as in Campanella's State of the Sun or More's Utopia can be truly explained only in connection with the episodes of the struggle of the masses, which Campanella and More knew, observing them in the present and studying in the past. In the ideological struggle that was continuously boiling in European society and reflecting the class struggle, the great figures of science and art have always stood up for the protection of the people's right to existence, worthy of man, the individual's right to freedom and perfection. And if they did not directly stand on the side of the revolutionary people, then with all the direction of their creativity they shattered the foundations of society that the ruling classes established. The folk, humanistic content of art became more distinct and brighter the larger and more talented artists were. Not always realizing the revolutionary goals of the people, great humanists acutely felt the situation of the universal revolution in which they lived. They were conscious of the profound difference between the worldview of the feudal, ecclesiastical and worldview of the new, between ascetic culture and culture, which affirms the living, full-blooded perception of life. The progressive people of the Renaissance felt with their whole being the breath of a new world. Minds are awake. Life has become a delight, enthusiastically exclaimed the German humanist Ulrich von Godon. In Italy, this sense of a new life reigned since the XV century. In France, Rabelais, in the novel Gargantua and Pantagruel, drew a panegyric to a new enlightenment. Gargantua wrote in a letter to his son Pantagruel, "As for the knowledge of the phenomena of nature, I would like you to give yourself to him with curiosity, that there was no sea, river or spring, which you would not know fish, and all the birds in air, all the trees, bushes and bushes of the forest, all the grasses on earth, all the metals in the bowels of it, all the jewels of the east and south, all this learn, let nothing be unknown to you." The sense of the new time was beautifully expressed by Giorgio Vasari in 1550, in the book, The Life of Remarkable Painters, Sculptors and Architects. The word Le Renascita was used in the sense in which it in its French form La Renaissance, and in Russian, the Renaissance became the name of time, progressive coup. But what the progressive Renaissance people gladly perceived as a decisive revolution in all areas of culture was often rejected by modern bourgeois historiography, blurring the line between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Bourgeois art historians and theater specialists seek to present the greatest progressive revolution as a simple, peaceful evolution, devoid of acute social contradictions, as a gradual transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. In this case, the ideas of the Renaissance are depicted as a kind of late scholasticism, of which a humanistic and revolutionary meaning is etched out. In every way pulling the culture of the Renaissance to the Middle Ages, trying to drive out the concept of revival from the history of culture, bourgeois scientists thereby try to establish the role of the creator of eternal ideas behind medieval science and to prove the firmness of these ideas. They argue that the Renaissance is the result of the full development of medieval culture in all the complexity of its spiritual, political and economic elements. The Middle Ages, of course, paved the way for the development of a qualitatively new culture. But the formation of this new art, a new culture, was realized only after a decisive break with the religious worldview, which could happen only in the situation of the universal revolution, in an era rightly called the greatest progressive coup. In the era of the progressive coup, the process of forming modern bourgeois nations began. The royal power, relying on the townspeople, broke the might of the feudal nobility and created large, essentially nationalized, monarchies in which modern European nations and modern bourgeois society developed. The estate monarchy gave way to the system of absolutism. Spain under the Habsburgs, England under the Tudors, France under Valois and the Bourbons turned into large absolute monarchies. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, Gospodarstdat, 1952, p. 3. This time in Western Europe is marked by the creation of a national culture and its basis, the national language. A great role in the formation of the national language played the great writers of the Renaissance. Their creativity in many ways contributed to the melting of the language of individual nationalities and national languages. They overcame the caste-closedness of the book language of the humanists. Their works sounded not in an alien people in Latin, but in their native language. The national language, which embraces all the richness of living folk speech and the age-old achievements of folklore creativity, full of strength, energy and beauty, formed the basis of new literature and a new theater, contributing to the rapprochement of art with reality. Progressive ideas and a single national language have made the Renaissance art close to the people, defined its realistic foundations. To a large extent, the features of the Renaissance art have affected the theater, without breaking ties with folk medieval spectacles, developing the healthy realistic shoots available in old genres. The theater became the spokesman for liberation, humanistic aspirations. Playwright aristocratic humanists, speaking with anti-popular ideological concepts, asserted an anti-democratic artistic program, demonstratively broke with a wide audience and established themselves in court theaters. Their chamber art produced nothing significant and could not produce. In contrast to these humanist aristocrats, the great figures of the Renaissance openly oriented themselves at the people's viewer, declared the people the main judge of their art, considering it an aesthetic assessment of the most just and reasonable. And people enthusiastically accepted the works of Shakespeare, Lope de Vega, Molière and a number of other great playwrights, recognizing in their writings their point of view on life, their understanding of good and evil, their judgment of beauty. It was in the theater, in the noise of nightly duels, in the laughter of commoners, in the philosophical monologues of heroes and the caustic jokes of clowns, that ordinary people learned the new truth, learned a new, not a religious, but a humanistic worldview that was in many ways close to their own real view of life. The nationality of a realistic drama affected primarily the broad scope of past and present events. The fate of man, the fate of the people was in the center of the works of Renaissance drama. The second manifestation of the theater's people was the character of dramatic conflicts that expressed the main contradictions of the era with progressive positions, past the struggle of humanistic, people's democratic principles with tyrannical, anti-people, manifested either in the form of feudal despotism or in the form of bourgeois egoism and self-interest. Finally, the third moment of the theater's nationality was the presence in it of a positive hero, endowed with features of powerful personality and painted with bright colors. This hero was himself a representative of the people. We often see such a hero in the dramas of Lope de Vega, or his fate reflected the tragic fate of the people, and he, enriched by deep thought, passionately sought a way out of the contradictions of the era, such as the hero of Shakespeare. The positive hero of the Renaissance drama, even with the tragic outcome of his personal destiny, remained confident of the ultimate victory of his ideal, and in this there was a remarkable optimism of the great artists, whose source was their belief in the strength of man, by virtue of a people capable of overcoming any hardships of their historical destiny. Thus, the humanistic ideology and the national character of the Renaissance drama determined the wide scope of thematic coverage, the social sharpness of conflicts and the titanism of its images. But the nationality and ideological aspirations of artists humanists were still historically limited. The reasons for this limitation were, first, the social immaturity of the broad masses and, secondly, that humanists are not yet ugly to see in the people a historical force capable of transforming the world. All this gave rise to internal contradictions in the world outlook and creative work of the best figures of Renaissance culture, in which the harsh criticism of modern living conditions was reconciled with the belief in the possibility of a peaceful resolution of social conflicts. On this basis, a utopian monarchism typical of Renaissance artists was born, features of individualism in the consciousness of their heroes, a departure in certain cases from the positions of realism. The Renaissance of the Renaissance recreated the pictures of life in all their truthfulness, while avoiding a naturalistic immersion in everyday life. Showing tragic conflicts, heroic deeds, the theater did not tear them away from the real basis of historical existence, giving the depicted events a philosophically generalized meaning and a vivid poetic expression. Tragic and comic on stage, as in reality, existed in unity. The Renaissance theater was close to folk lyrics and epics, which acquired a humanistic meaning and were in tune with Renaissance realism with its epic power and poetic passion. The peculiarity of realistic Renaissance drama was also revealed in the remarkable art of creating multifaceted characters, the psychology of which was revealed in all its complexity and depth. In direct dependence on the realism of the drama, there was also the development of the stage realism of the Renaissance theater. For the scenic art of the Renaissance, there is a profound interest in the inner world of man. Instead of the exaggerated pathetic of the mystery and the crude buffoonery of the farce, the Renaissance theater demands the psychological penetration into the image, the simplicity and naturalness of the senses, and the actor's understanding of the ideological meaning of the work. All great playwrights humanists consider theater a mirror of life and a school of morals. So for them, the actor is not an empty lover, but an attentive observer of life, the embodiment of deep ideas and living images. Humanist writers oppose the rampant rudeness of the playground game, against the self-willed comedy of the absent-minded, against the senseless, exaggeratedly pretentious reading of the roles. But, weaning the actors from the primitivism of the medieval theater, the playwrights humanists did not encroach on the basic, truly folk traditions of the square play, in view of which their own works were created. Under the new conditions, these traditions were expressed in the epic power and passion of recitation, in the inner energy, the impetuosity of action, the obsession of actors with passions, tragic, stunning spectators, then comic. The tragic execution at the time of its highest ascent was interwoven with the art of inspired folk storytellers, and the comic filled with elements of aria, buffoon improvisations. The actor was looking for strong, vivid means of expression to conquer a noisy, crowded audience. From the traditions of the People's Theatre remained the principle of syncretism of performance, when music, song and dances organically intertwined into dramatic action. Preserved in the Renaissance theater and some scenic conventions of the medieval theater, requiring from the viewer an activity of imagination. Realism of the Renaissance, like the humanistic movement as a whole, underwent a significant evolution during the 16th–17th centuries. The new theater, which began its history in Italy at the end of the XV century, first developed under the sign of militant opposition to medieval asceticism of a cheerful secular worldview. During the feudal Catholic reaction, the Italian theater, like all Italian culture, entered a period of decline, and Spain became the center of development of world theater art. Here the heroic traditions of the Reconquista and the national upsurge of the early 16th century served as the basis for the birth of a kind of realistic national drama that, despite having some features of a religious and noble worldview, was generally permeated with the spirit of a nationality and humanism. The final stage in the development of the first period of the Renaissance theater was the work of the English playwrights, the predecessors of Shakespeare and the early Shakespeare, who still believed in the possibility of a peaceful, harmonious solution of social contradictions. The second period of the history of the Renaissance theater falls on the last decade of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, when the collapse of feudal Catholic absolutism in Spain was fully determined, but capitalist contradictions in England were all too sharp. Humanistic consciousness is experiencing the greatest maturity of its development. The illusions of universal prosperity are dispelled by a harsh reality. If before the humanists believed that there is harmony between the individual and society, now, comprehending the essence of reality, they call for combating the evil that reigns in it. The realism of the Renaissance theater acquires a courageous tone, social conflicts are given greater depth, the nationality is expressed in an open protest against the prevailing social order. The highest achievement of realism of this period was the work of Lope de Vega and Shakespeare. Lope de Vega created a series of plays from the life of the peasants, among which the most outstanding is the popular revolutionary drama, Fuente Ovejuna. Shakespeare, through the power of his genius, revealed with the greatest consistency and depth the basic conflicts of the age, branded the new idol of exploiting society property. speaking with ruthless criticism of social relations, showing the tragedy of the fate of the people. The humanistic thought in the works of Shakespeare does not renounce his belief in the strength of man and the people. The period of the Universal Revolution ended with the stabilization of new forms of exploitation. Class contradictions sharply escalated, and if, on the one hand, the feudal Catholic reaction intensified, then on the other hand, the predatory nature of the triumphant capitalism was becoming more and more evident. These historical conditions determined the third, final stage of humanism, in which the humanistic ideals are reborn. Having lost contact with the people, art lost the most important features of Renaissance realism: social ideals and moral criteria. The dramaturgy of the late Renaissance is marked by a miraculous, sensual revelry of sensuality, a pathological cult of individualism, a blasphemous mockery of the noblest human feelings. Seeing in man only the source of evil and vice, denying any moral basis of human judgments, the dramaturgy of this period found restraining and guiding force only in divine consent, in the mystical interference of the sky and human affairs. This kind of drama was created in England after Shakespeare. Such playwright epigons as Webster, Turner, Ford. This reactionary turn of Renaissance dramaturgy was especially evident in the religious dramas of Calderon, the last playwright of the Renaissance. In the 17th century, under the conditions of the complete affirmation of absolutism, a new style was being formed, classicism, which retained a number of progressive features of the Renaissance theater. Beginning its development in Italy, the classic drama and theater received their final expression in absolutist France. With the emergence of classicism, the process of the formation of the theatrical aesthetics, imbued with an understanding of the national goals of the theater, is connected. While absolutism played historically a progressive role, an ideal idea of the state made it possible to affirm the idea of the primacy of the interests of the state and society over the interests of the individual. According to these ideas, the absolutist state embodied the mind. The passions of the individual were to be subordinated to reason, and society as a whole to the king. Thus, the absolutist monarchy became the bearer of social ideals. This deprived the classicism of the organic nationality and democracy inherent in the art of the Renaissance. The realistic aspirations of classicism turned out to be limited to the idealization principle and the rationalistic method of creating character types. But, despite the basic limitations and rationality of the art of classicism, the ideas of civil service to society and the protection of Stoic morals had, of course, a progressive meaning. In the second half of the 7th century, French classicism was the only art that can reveal the inner world of man, and preserved in the works of Corneille and Racine civic ideals and moral norms of humanity. Art classicism strongly opposed précieuses, this straight-line continuer hedonistic late Renaissance art. The detailed characteristic of classicism is given in the chapter devoted to the French theater of the 7 centuries. Particularly decisive fighter with this reactionary art, as well as with the deathly sides of the classicist aesthetics, was the great Molière, who committed within the classicism of comedy reform on realistic principles. Proceeding from the traditions of the popular farce theater and setting itself the goals of a humanistic order, Molière severely criticized the social deformities that were generated by the nobility and bourgeois property. Branding the vicars of the ruling classes, Molière contrasted them with the high morality and common sense of the common people. Molière, the last representative of the great pleiad of humanists, was at the same time the forerunner of the enlightened free-thinking of the 18th century. His work became a connecting link of two great eras in the field of culture, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.